"Take off that silly costume," my father whispered, just loud enough to carry to the back pews, just sharp enough to slice the pipe organ in half. The final chord hung in the chapel rafters like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. Someone fumbled a phone. It struck the stone aisle with a brittle clack. The stained glass, sailors and saints frozen mid-blessing, threw red and violet squares over my shoulder boards. 4 silver stars on my collar caught the light and threw it right back. I stood at the mouth of the aisle in full dress whites, the crease in my trousers like a drawn line I dared anyone to cross. I had stood this way on hangar decks with the wind shoving the sea sideways, in briefing rooms at 0400 with coffee that tasted like penance, in corridors where the air smelled like jet fuel and cold metal. It was a familiar stillness. Only today the air smelled of lilies, candle wax, and whatever expensive cologne Richard Morgan had drowned himself in before deciding to drown me. "It's a wedding, Claire, not Fleet Week," he added, eyes flicking down the pews, calibrating. He did this with board members when he wanted them to laugh at the same time. He wanted a laugh now. He got silence. Then I heard it. Boots. Not a shuffle, not a scatter, a cadence, measured, undeniable, the kind of sound that puts your spine at attention before your brain has caught up. The oak doors at the back of the chapel trembled once, as if the building inhaled. Sunlight paced across the floor as if it too were aligning on command. "Admiral on deck!" The words were a clean strike of metal on metal. The doors flew wide. They entered 2 by 2, dress uniforms crisp, covers squared, white gloves a bright geometry in all that stained glass color. The SEAL honor guard moved like a single body with many hands. Guests angled for a better look and then realized there was no better in this, only witness. I didn't move. Stillness is a tool when you've learned how to use it. The moment tested its edge against me and found it held. My father's smirk twitched, confused, then cooled. He hates variables that aren't his. He has always hated variables that are me. I took the aisle. The organist, perhaps out of reflex, found a quiet register, then thought better of it and lifted his hands away as if the keys were a crime scene. Each heel strike of my shoes set off a clean tuck in the nave, echoing up, returning down, a metronome that belonged to me. My service ribbons chimed the soft, private sound they make when they settle, metal remembering weight. Ryan waited at the altar. He didn't smile. Smiles are for photographs. He saluted, palm like a blade, angle perfect, and with that, we set the terms of the room. "Is she a general?" a child asked somewhere near the front, in the bright way children kick open doors grown-ups pretend are walls. My father leaned forward, mouth thin. "You're making a fool of yourself," he hissed, like a stage cue no one else agreed to follow. I did not answer. Silence can be louder than an order if you let it, and then the silence broke, not with music, but with resolve. 1,000 tiny cloth sounds as men and women shifted in unison. The cells rose. Back rows first, then the middle, then the front, like a tide climbing stone. White gloves lifted, chins squared, bodies locked to attention in a harmony of discipline that no orchestra would dare compete with. 150 hands snapped to salute. Sound leaves a dent when it's precise. That many wrists cutting air at the same moment carved the hush into something holy. Sunlight, hot, emphatic, poured down through the window of St. Brendan at Sea and flamed across my shoulder, my stars, the edges of Ryan's jaw. Dust motes turned to bright confetti and then drifted into being ordinary again. My father looked behind him. That was new. He rarely looks back at anything. He counted without realizing he was counting. SEALs in row after row. Officers I had served with, and some who had served before me. Civilians who understood what it means when a room decides to stand. His mouth opened around a quip that did not arrive. For once, the man who could always summon a line found his stage suddenly honest. I kept walking, measured and unhurried. The organ did not return. The ship of the moment had its own engines. The heat of the candles gave off the wax-sweet smell of birthdays and funerals, and every ritual that says we remember, we mark, we mean this. At the altar, Ryan lowered his salute and extended his hand. I took it. Admiral Moore, retired, but formidable enough to make stone consider its posture, nodded once, and began the ceremony in a voice that had survived typhoons and capital hearings. He named my rank, my stations, my years at sea. He named Ryan's. He named duty as if it were a living witness. My father sat very straight, hands folded like a man who has just realized that there are rules he did not write and cannot buy. Somewhere in the back, the child asked, more quietly this time, "So, is she?" "Yes," someone murmured. "She is." The light shifted. The world did its ordinary spinning. Inside the chapel, gravity chose a side. The man who mocked my uniform finally fell silent. And the rest of us, those who know what a salute costs and why it's given, proceeded. Before the lilies and the medals, there was the kitchen table with a permanent smell of lemon oil and a father who treated silence like a leash. Richard Morgan ran his company from a glass tower and our home like a second boardroom. He prized outcomes that could be tallied, framed, and mounted. My childhood was a ledger with glittering columns. Piano recitals with metronome timing, tennis trophies lined by height, report cards laminated and filed. He did not yell, he calibrated. When I was 7 and misspelled admirable in a spelling bee, he didn't comfort me. He slid the word back across the table later that night and said, "Learn to be what you tried to spell." Presence for him was a performance review. If I entered a room, his eyes did the quick scan, posture, attire, composure, as if I were a quarterly update with legs. He praised my brother Ethan in uninterrupted paragraphs, entrepreneurial, intuitive, a wolf among lambs. With me, he treated compliments like bonus stock, granted rarely, vested over time, and always with a clawback clause. The first time I saw a ship up close, I was 9. The hull rose like night itself, steel eating sky, and yet the sailors around it moved with a choreography that made the impossible seem briefly obedient. A chief let me touch the anchor chain with 2 fingers. It was cold enough to turn bone into bell. When she said, "This takes a village of hands," it lodged somewhere behind my ribs and pulsed. I went home and drew equipment lists on napkins, diagrams of teamwork, arrows that always led forward. Richard glanced at my sketches and said, "Cute, but ships are for people who can't own the harbor." He liked to say he was allergic to theater, no patience for pageantry, just the hard math of results. Yet every dinner party was a stage, every anecdote rehearsed. He wore understatement like an expensive suit, no visible logos, everything bespoke. The hypocrisy would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so efficiently. When the Naval Academy letter arrived, I opened it over the sink, as if the ink might spill. The envelope said United States in a tone I had never been addressed with. I read it 3 times, then once more for the hush between the sentences, and felt something like weather lift inside me. I'd spent years mastering his tests. The academy offered a different exam with a different answer key. Honor, courage, commitment. Words that didn't need to be laminated to matter. He said, "You're fleeing accountability disguised as service." "You mean your accountability," I said, and watched the air go thin. At plebe summer, I learned to fold time into squares you could stack. I learned that sleep is a rumor, and teamwork is a fact. I learned to blend sweat with salt wind until both tasted like progress. I learned how to take an order and how to be worth following. I learned, crucially, that humor at 0300 can keep a room from becoming a grave. Each achievement I mailed home, a pin, a photo, a letter stiff with salt, returned as a discussion about optics. "Don't embarrass yourself," he'd say, when I mentioned the Marine Corps Marathon. "Don't play soldier," when I sent a picture of my first set of dress whites. "Don't be dramatic," when I asked him to attend commissioning week. That was his favorite accusation, as if my life were a hobby horse with ribbons braided into a mane. Drama was what he named anything he couldn't choreograph. The years unspooled, deployments measured in wake lines and watch rotations, friendships welded by storms and bad coffee. The kind of laughter that comes from being alive exactly where it's hardest. My hands learned the shape of a railing at dawn. My eyes learned the exact color of the ocean when a storm is thinking hard about consequences. I learned to write condolence letters with a steadiness that made my fingers ache afterward. I learned to deliver news in rooms where the clock refused to behave kindly. Before every new stripe, I sat on my bunk and listened to the ship breathe, her low, patient respiration, and promised to earn the authority I was about to wear. When I came home between deployments, the house was quieter, more expensive. Ethan hung new degrees on the hallway, all of them heavy with fonts. My father began inviting donors and judges to dinners designed like checkmate problems. If I wore a uniform, he introduced me as our theatrical daughter, eyes skimming the room to collect the laughs like loose coins. The first time he reached for my ribbons, 2 fingers landing too close to the metal, I caught his wrist without breaking my smile. "Not a prop, Dad," I said. He looked genuinely baffled, like a man who has been told that gravity is optional. The last straw was a morning on the patio, the city still blurry with heat, when he pronounced over grapefruit that real power never salutes. I answered, "Real power knows when to," and we stared at each other across the table, like 2 countries choosing their border. Then came Ryan, quiet where my father was loud, precise where he was performative, a man who had learned to fill silence with competence. He didn't tell stories, he carried them. His service record read like a redacted poem. He taught me a new kind of patience, the kind that isn't waiting so much as readiness. My father tried to bait him with compliments, disguised as traps. "Impressive resume," he'd say, "for a man who takes orders." Ryan would respond, "The best orders are the ones you're proud to follow." Their conversations unfolded like chess, where one player keeps trying to use a calculator. When we told my father we'd be married in the chapel on Beacon Street, he nodded as if approving a merger. "Attire," he said, already scheduling the optics. "Tails for the men. Black tie for the rest." Then he glanced at me. "No costumes." "You mean my uniform," I said, not blinking. He folded his napkin and placed it on the table with that measured finality he used to end meetings. Don't escalate, Claire. I'm trying to spare you. Theatrics invite ridicule. He spoke like a man offering a parachute from a perfectly good plane. I didn't tell him that the planes I trusted had been shot at and still landed. The week before the wedding, the honor guard confirmed. I gave them my only non-negotiable. The moment belongs to the ceremony, not to me. They understood. Warriors know how to make their presence about something larger than themselves. I did not tell my father. It wasn't secrecy, it was mercy. I gave him the chance to surprise himself. He didn't take it. On the rehearsal night, he toasted Ethan's expansion fund with lavish applause. Toasted the groomsmen's promise as young executives. Toasted the venue's world-class discretion. When he raised his glass to me, he said, "To my daughter, who never met a stage she didn't love." People laughed, because people always do when power tells them it's safe. The laugh landed like sleet. After, in the corridor, beneath a painting of a ship that had never seen a storm, he brushed his fingers along the empty space on my dress where my ribbons would be the next day. "Leave the props at home," he said softly, like a man placing a fragile vase back on the shelf. "For me." I looked at the painting. Sails perfect as if ironed, sea obligingly calm, and thought of steel hulls and engines older than everyone aboard, and chiefs teaching 19-year-olds how not to die, and a cook who once wrote, "Happy B-Day ends," on a sheet cake big enough to qualify as a deck. I thought of a night watch when the ocean went black enough to erase history, and we kept moving anyway because movement was the job. I thought of funerals at sea, with wind so clean you could hear your own bones breathe. "Not for you," I said. "Not anymore." The next morning, I pinned each ribbon with hands steady enough to suture, buckled silver that knew my weight, and checked the crease in my trousers like a ritual. In the mirror, I saw not staging, but scaffolding. Not costume, but covenant. I thought of that 9-year-old touching anchor chain and finally felt the delayed shock of a circle closing. If the hook was the strike, the wound was the bell it rang. Years of being told that duty is theater and that theater is shame. He believed about me what he needed to believe, that I hungered for an audience. The truth was simpler and far less photogenic. I wanted the room to keep its shape when the wind changed. I wanted to earn the salute I would one day be given. I wanted to stand inside a promise and not blink. So I walked into that chapel in whites that had survived salt, rust, and sunlight, carrying the quiet of ships on long water and the noise of men and women who make impossible things routine. My father brought a smirk and a script. I brought a life. He reached for the line he'd rehearsed. The door answered with boots. This is how wounds work. They teach you what you'll no longer swallow. They make a flute out of your bones and force you to learn the right song. And if you practice long enough, if you stand long enough in the weather, the day comes when the music answers back. When it did in that chapel, even he heard it. The choice wasn't cinematic. It was Tuesday at 5:17, dawn grinding a pale edge along the blinds. The city still yawned still. Ryan's side of the bed was warm air and square folds. He was on the balcony with a mug, watching the light learn the buildings by name. "We can do it quietly," he said, not turning. His voice had the low ballast of a man who has made peace with storms. "Or we can do it right." Quiet would have been a white dress, pearls, an apology smuggled into compromise. Right would be the dress whites that had outlived 3 ships and a hurricane season. The record pinned above my heart, 4 silver stars shining like commas in a sentence I was not finished writing. I pictured the chapel, the nave's soft acoustics, the ribs of wood holding up the thinking sky, 1,000 slivers of saint light laying themselves across pews that had survived generations of vows. I pictured my father's mouth rehearsing a joke and the room obliging. Then I pictured a different air, one in which those jokes turned to chalk. "Right," I said. "Catalysts are small when you hold them. Only history reveals their size." I called Admiral Moore at 6:02, the way you call a lighthouse rather than a friend. He answered like a man halfway down a corridor with a problem in one hand and a pen in the other. When I asked him to officiate, there was a pause, not of reluctance, but of inventory. You could hear him lining up the chessboard: protocol, optics, duty, kindness. Then he said, "Ceremony is how we teach crowds to mean things." "I'll be there." The uniform question required no debate. "Wear it," he said, as if I had proposed oxygen. "The day honors the promise you keep, not the dress you don't." He offered no pep talk. Respect doesn't rummage in your pockets to prove it's there. Ryan made the next call. He didn't ask the cells for spectacle. He asked for presence. There's a difference. "No sabers, no theatrics," he said to Chief Alvarez, the kind of quiet legend who folds his myth into his socks. "Just a living witness." She wants the room to know which rules apply. Chief Alvarez answered with a sentence built like a standing order. "We'll rise when she does." Logistics began to purr. I sent a short note to the chapel's coordinator that said, "There will be an honor guard. We'll manage cadence to avoid interfering with liturgy." She replied with a one-line smile disguised as a clause. "We'll tell the organist to trust the moment." Then the harder call, my mother. She has learned to live in the calm eye of Richard's weather system, arranging flowers there, reading whole novels while the edges of the world storm. "He will be furious," she said, but it wasn't warning, it was weather report. "Do you want me to manage him?" "No," I said, "not this time." She exhaled, a tired little bird of a sound, and said, "Then ask for what you want as if you deserve it." "It will confuse him." The line clicked with the soft finality of two women choosing to stop apologizing. I emailed the ushers a diagram that looked like a parable. Officers forward left, family up front center. Honor guard interleaved toward the back to allow a plainclothes tribe to see itself stand. I sent the verger a schedule with margins wide enough to hold surprises. I sent nothing to my father. The last piece of the trigger was smaller than a ribbon and heavier than a threat: the decision not to rehearse a response. Ryan and I do contingency as a reflex, plan A through Zulu. But I refused to choreograph the moment of insult I knew was coming. You cannot prepare dignity. You can only build the musculature that lets it stand up on demand. We packed the whites and the metals like traveling altars. I taped a seam repair kit to the inside cover because sailors overbuild even their hope. Ryan tucked a note into his pocket. 8 words, printed in his clean, capacious hand, that I didn't see until later. He kissed my brow with the tenderness of a man blessing a compass. "We're not performing," he said. "We're reporting." By Wednesday, the wedding planner had sent her neutral, panic-proof email. "We love your vision. Quick question, will guests be rising?" I answered with military brevity. "Some will. It'll be orderly." She wrote back a string of emojis that looked like deep breaths in cartoon. Thursday brought the rehearsal dinner and the first tremor. Richard toasted the young executives with a generosity that had teeth. He signaled the photographer to stay close. He wanted candids that could later be weaponized into narratives. Afterward, in the corridor, he touched the empty spot on my dress where the ribbons would live and said, "For me." The old spell tried to lift, the one where I shrink until I fit inside his idea of me. It did not lift. Spells don't survive the daylight of earned rank. On Friday, Chief Alvarez texted, "Headcount higher than predicted." Word traveled. I stared at the number, 150, and felt anxiety try to masquerade as responsibility. Was this too much? Would the room turn the stand into a show? Ryan read the text over my shoulder and smiled with just the left side of his mouth. "It's not about number. It's about together," he said. "Better to be too many when telling the truth." That night, I ironed my trousers with the care of a surgeon sterilizing resolve. I pinned and repinned until each ribbon sat with the assurance of a law. On the dresser, I laid out the cover that had shaded me on a dozen decks. The brim still carried the faintest ghost of salt. Oceans remember you in minerals. Sleep came like a well-trained dog, on command, at the foot of the bed, alert even while resting. Morning. We moved in silence that felt more like coordination than quiet. The city did its gull and bus chorus, indifferent to our private festival. I slid into the whites and felt the seams answer like old friends. Ryan knotted his tie with the grim elegance of a man polite to fate. My phone buzzed. "We're in position," Alvarez sent. "No cue needed, we'll know." You can tell a true unit by the way it senses without being told. At the chapel steps, the sexton eyed my stars and squared his shoulders in a reflex older than his training. He held the door as if holding a line. Inside, the air had that polished wood coolness that makes you instinctively moderate your voice. People turned. Their expressions did math. You could see them carrying two numbers, wedding and worship, and trying to reconcile the sum. Most smiled. A few did that social half-smile that means, "I will decide later how I feel." Two older women put their hands over their hearts the way some people clasp pearls, not as fear, but as respect. In the front pew, Richard sat with the confidence of a man who has never needed to check a map. His cufflinks, small sons, warmed themselves under the chandeliers. When he saw the stars at my collar, his face did not change. Men who live in mirrors get good at face management. He leaned toward me as I passed and released the line he'd polished on the drive. "Take off that silly costume." Catalysts need contact to ignite. His words struck the flint. The oak doors at the back swung, oxygen rushed the spark, and the room combusted, not into flame, but into attention. "Admiral on deck!" They rose, and the air chose its allegiance. What started as a personal decision, a Tuesday at 5:17 with coffee and a balcony, became an architecture. The choice to wear the truth on my chest set logistics, then people, then history in motion. The beauty of a real catalyst is that it doesn't beg the reaction, it simply makes the reaction unavoidable. The moment locked into place. The organist lifted his hands off the keys as if they were sacred or dangerous, or both. Ryan's profile sharpened under the stained glass as if the light were proud to work that hard. And at the far front, Richard, the man who taught me that control is the only god worth tithing to, looked over his shoulder at a rising sea and felt, perhaps for the first time, the old god step aside. He had tried to make my life a cautionary tale against theatrics. He had not accounted for the theater of honor. He never understood that some rituals don't center you, they center the vow. By the time I reached the altar, the catalyst had done its work. That quiet Tuesday had turned into a public physics. The reaction would now finish itself. We planned the ceremony the way you plan a mission you can't afford to win loudly. First, terrain. The chapel wasn't just pretty, it was mappable. Nave like a corridor, transepts as lateral movement, choir loft as overwatch. The aisle became a narrow channel with good sightlines and a single point of failure. The front pew where Richard would sit with his confidence and his cufflinks. We scaled a floor plan to 1 to 50 and treated pews like rows of bulkheads. I'd learned long ago that elegance is simply preparedness wearing pearls. Seating was strategy. Officers and veterans forward left, a visible backbone that would anchor the room's posture. Civilian family and donors front center. Those most susceptible to suggestion, placed where their eyes couldn't avoid the truth of 100 small decisions lining up into honor. Seals interleaved toward the back, staggered in pairs, not for intimidation, but for distributed calm. If a single row rises, people wonder. If the room unfolds like a tide, people remember what respect feels like. Ushers were briefed as if they were line handlers. Quiet hands, minimal chatter, no last-minute heroics. Their job wasn't to herd, but to smooth. They received a card with 3 phrases. Please hold. Right this way. We'll begin shortly. And a reminder that tone does half the work. We gave the verger a timing sheet with 2 deliberate buffer zones where nothing needed to happen. Places where breath could be taken if the day tried to sprint. Weddings go feral when no one leaves space for grace. Comms were human, not electronic. No earpieces, no militarizing the church. We used a handful of prearranged cues. Ryan would touch his cuff once to signal that the aisle was clear. The organist would lift both hands off the keys to surrender the room to the moment. Admiral Moore would square his shoulders to tell the honor guard their presence had been received and could now fade into stillness. It looked like body language because that's what good signals always look like. Contingencies came next. 1 for optics, 1 for weather, 3 for Richard. Optics. If any guest raised a phone to film the honor guard's entrance, 2 ushers would step forward with polite simultaneity and offer to take the photo after the ceremony. It's easier to redirect attention than to confiscate it. Weather. If the summer sky shifted toward dramatic rain, the kind that makes stained glass look like it's crying, we had towels in the narthex and a backup procession path with fewer slick steps. Respect is also friction control. Richard A. Quip. If he issued a cutting remark, take off the costume, I would not respond. Silence is the only reply that doesn't feed cruelty. The plan gave the line somewhere to die, in air that refused to carry it. Ryan would keep his gaze forward. Admiral Moore would begin the ceremony without waiting for laughter to pass. Because laughter never came when the room decided to grow up. Richard B. Touch. If he reached for the ribbons, he had tried once before, I would take 1 step back without breaking posture, as if making room for a non-existent passerby. Movement can translate insult into accident without granting it dignity. Richard C. Escalation. If his hand went from touch to grab, Ryan would move 1/2 step laterally, placing his body between us without confrontation, leveraging proximity rather than force. I've seen fights ended by 3 inches of polite refusal. There was also a Plan D we never printed, because superstition and wisdom are twins. If he attempted a public scene beyond words, Chief Alvarez would rise and say only, "Sir," in that low God voice chiefs inherit from the ocean. I have watched grown men reconsider their entire biographies after hearing a chief say "sir" that way. De-escalation was not the whole plan. Elevation was. Ceremony, when true, ferries meaning from the private to the plural. We designed beats that moved like tides, entrance to stillness, to vow to silence, to blessing, to release. The honor guard's rise would not be the point. It would be the context. Admiral Moore's homily would be under 7 minutes. Brevity is a kind of respect, and would hinge on one sentence we drafted together. Rank is not an entitlement to be displayed, but a promise to be kept in public. He crossed out "displayed" and wrote "worn," which pleased me more than it should have. Photography had rules. No stealth paparazzi nonsense. 1 photographer in the loft, 1 near the chancel, shooting from the knees during the honor guard's movement. Shutters throttled, so the sound wouldn't compete with the salutes. Images are instruments. We chose to play them quietly. We assigned a civilian ally, Aunt Jo, a woman whose voice could land a plane. She would sit beside my mother with a script of simple interventions. If Richard began to mutter to her, his old habit of importing an audience into his aside, Aunt Jo's job was to look at him with the gentle bewilderment of a librarian at a firework and say, "Hush, darling, we're reading." Admiral Moore's brief included 2 dynamic checks. If the honor guard's entrance overshot the room's composure, easy in a confined space, he'd begin with a grounding minute, a reading of the names of sailors who had stood in that chapel over the last century. It's hard to be petty when history is in the room taking attendance. Conversely, if the room was timid, if respect had shown up wearing politeness, he'd open with a single question to the guests. "Who taught you your first promise?" The pause afterward would sort priorities finer than any lecture. Ryan and I rehearsed vows with economy. We chose words that could withstand pressure. No florid metaphors. The sea hates big claims. I will go where your courage requires calm. I will guard your quiet. I will not mistake spectacle for witness. The rings were simple gold, thick enough to be found by cold fingers in the dark. You learn to test symbolism for grip. Dress drill mattered. My whites had to sit like truth, not theater. I stitched a hidden hook at the hem to prevent a telltale sway when nerves try to wag your jacket. I checked collar points like a pilot checks flaps. I practiced walking the aisle with a coin on the head, not to balance it, but to make sure I didn't care if it fell. Some days your power is measured by what you refuse to chase. We also planned for quiet after. No grand exit through a tunnel of sabers. No staged dip and kiss to feed the cameras. We would sign the book in the sacristy, shake the verger's hand, and let the room release itself. The party could happen later. The point was the promise. Everything fit into a single folder labeled Ceremony Live. Inside, floor plan, timing sheet, rolls, 2 index cards for the ushers, a cloth tucked into the flap for wiping a scuff off a shoe or a tear off a cheek, whichever dared appear. On the final page, in Ryan's blocky, patient print, the contingency printed in 8 words I refused to read beforehand. He carried that page in his inside pocket like a fuse you only pull if the ship is truly taking on water. We didn't choreograph the cells salute. We trusted them. That was the point. Command is not about making people move. It's about building a world where they move themselves in the right direction at the right time for the right reason. The morning of, the plan did what good plans do. It disappeared. I didn't think about diagrams or contingencies. I thought about the smell of polish that had seeped into the wood over a century of ceremonies. I thought about the way light travels through colored glass and still finds you. I thought about the first time I took the con and the ocean answered in a language older than my fear. And then we walked in. Richard spoke his line like a man tugging a lever he was sure still controlled the room. The organist lifted his hands. The doors opened. The cells stood. The sound of 150 salutes cut the air clean. There are moments when a plan stops being a set of instructions and becomes a diagnosis. Here is the difference between performance and vow, between control and command, between a costume and a covenant. Everything was now set for the part no plan can own, the public collision. It happened the way weather turns. First, a hush. Then, a pressure you can't name. Then the sudden certainty that the sky has decided. Admiral Moore's voice was mid-syllable. Therefore, in the presence of, when a small, private click cut through the chapel. Richard had unlatched his cuff, the tiniest metal admission that he was done pretending to sit this one out. His hand drifted from his knee as if idling, then rose with a practiced casualness that belonged to boardrooms and back channels. He reached for me exactly the way he reached for outcomes, as if the reaching were already permission. 2 fingers angled toward the ribbons. There are 100 ways to move in a crisis. The worst is fast. I took the planned step back, a polite inch of air that turned his grasp into a reach. The room did that collective intake, the human equivalent of a barometer dropping. The quartet's violist tightened her grip without meaning to. The bow creaked like an old stair. He didn't retreat. He followed the inch I had made and closed it, fingers hooking under the edge of the top row of color. It's a small, ugly sound when metal meets entitlement, a tinny tick that manages to feel personal. Ryan moved. Not a lunge, not a shove. 1 half-step lateral, a rotation of the torso, the clean geometry of someone who has measured rooms for a living. His left hand found Richard's wrist with the gentleness you use to take a glass from a toddler before it shatters. Thumb to the radial nerve. Not enough pressure for pain. Just enough to remind the hand who owns it. Ryan's right hand came up, not to strike, but to anchor the air between us. Palm open, fingers steady. A signal older than language. Stop. He didn't raise his voice. Command never needs volume. Remove your hand. Those ribbons represent fallen sailors. 8 words. Clear enough to reach the loft, quiet enough to respect the dead. They landed like a stamp on wet wax. The chapel sealed. For a beat, Richard tried to do his old alchemy, turn consequences into optics. He smiled, that old photogenic, empty smile. The one that suggested we were all in on a joke, but the room had learned a new definition of we in the last 5 minutes, and the joke didn't survive the translation. Chief Alvarez stood just enough. He didn't advance. He did not need to. "Sir," he said, and the word rearranged molecules. A dozen other chiefs in a dozen other lives echoed through that single syllable. Richard's wrist loosened under Ryan's hand, as if the bones themselves had decided to cooperate. Admiral Moore, unflappable as tides, did not scold or narrate. He let the silence grade the moment. Silence can be a teacher when you refuse to interrupt it. Richard looked at Ryan, then at me, then at the rows of uniforms holding their stillness like a bridge. He was a man accustomed to mirrors. This was the first time the glass had looked back. "I'm her father," he said, almost conversational, banking left toward plausible deniability. He needed this to be about a family squabble. He needed it small. "That's why you should go first," Ryan answered, the line landing with a softness that somehow felt like steel. He released the wrist, not a flourish, just the sensible end of an intervention. "Apologize to the ribbons before they have to forgive you." And a murmur traveled the room. Not mutiny, not theater, more like consensus finding its throat. Faces that had once performed politeness now wore the human expression you see at sea when someone finally names the wave you've all been riding. Richard straightened, tugged his cuff back into its orbit, and tried one last trick, the private whisper meant for public consumption. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said to me, quiet as gossip, confident the air would smuggle it. The air, loyal to physics not power, refused. I didn't answer. I let the ribbons answer for me. I let the white of my dress answer, and the scuffs the world can't see, and the weight of metal that isn't heavy until someone who hasn't earned it tries to lift it. Richard's protege, one of his young lion executives, half rose as if to offer a life raft to a sinking narrative. He glanced toward the back rows where the cells stood like a second shoreline, then sat down again, a decision falling through him like a stone through deep water. Admiral Moore cleared his throat, not to fill the room, but to return it to itself. "Mr. Morgan," he said, using the name the city used when it wanted money, not power. "We are at a ceremony, not a negotiation." The Admiral's gaze moved to the guests, warm and precise. "And ceremony has rules." "Chief?" "Room, stand easy," Alvarez called, the two words softening the posture of 100 spines without dropping an ounce of respect. A tide receded without a single shoe scuffing wood. Richard's mouth opened, then did not finish the sentence it had planned. He looked down at his hand, the one that had reached. He looked at the ribbons, which did not tremble. He looked at my mother, whose eyes had the clean shine of a coastline after storm. The choice arrived like a doorway he had never noticed. He could step through it or stage a scene in the hall. For once in his life, staging looked smaller than silence. His chin dipped. Not a bow, he is not fluent in that language, but a visible punctuation mark. He took his hand back to his lap and kept it there. Ryan faded a half step, the way a good bodyguard becomes scenery the instant the danger dissolves. He didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved, which is how victory behaves when it isn't about winning. Admiral Moore resumed as if the interruption had been an intentional moment of instruction. "Where were we?" he asked. And those of us who knew the answer, at the part where dignity enters and stays, smiled. I caught Aunt Jo's eye. She raised one eyebrow, the universal sign for, "We will discuss this later in the kitchen with pie." My mother exhaled a breath she'd been saving since before I was born. "Proceed," I said softly. To no one and to everyone, the word returned to me changed, as if it had been baptized in a river older than the city. Ryan reached into his inside pocket, took out the page with the contingency sentence, looked at it once, and folded it back without reading it aloud. The fuse remained unlit. It had served its purpose by existing. We turned to our vows. When I spoke, my voice didn't shake. When Ryan answered, the stained glass seemed to listen harder. The rings, a simple, stubborn gold, slid home with the obedience of things asked to do their exact job. In the front pew, Richard sat uncharacteristically still. His face had lost the glossy confidence of a man conducting an audience, and gained the unaccustomed gravity of a man being conducted by one. The Sals, now at ease, held the quiet like professionals. The civilians did what civilians do best when you trust them. They came with us. You plan for confrontation and hope for recognition. Recognition is what happened next. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first step in its direction. A man seeing, briefly and undeniably, that the world has rules he did not invent. The ceremony flowed forward. The tide had turned. The empire of mirrors had cracked, and through the seam came air. The quiet after a storm is not silence. It is order returning to its seat. Admiral Moore closed the book with a measured grace that felt older than paper. He lifted his eyes to the congregation. "Let us say a simple thing plainly," he began. "What you have witnessed is not spectacle. It is a reminder. Rank is a promise worn in public." He let the sentence hang, not as a reprimand, but as a coat peg. People reached up and hung something of themselves on it. Pride, memory, grief, relief. Then he did something I had not asked for and will thank him for until my bones retire. He invited a breath. "We'll take a moment," he said, "to stand with those whose names are stitched into these colors. No roll call, no trumpet, just air shared." It moved through the nave like light, correcting its posture. Heads bowed, some hands found other hands. Chief Alvarez's jaw eased, as if a gear had finally meshed. When the Admiral looked back to us, he wore that small, mischievous kindness generals get when they remember they are human. "Proceed," he said, and he said it like a blessing. I turned to the room. This is the part where many brides offer a flourish, some bright ribbon of gratitude. I kept it shorter than a salute. "Thank you for standing," I said. "We won't forget who stood." The line didn't clap for itself. It walked out into the pews and sat down beside people who needed it. Ryan followed with a line of his own, one we'd never rehearsed. He faced the guests, then Richard. "Ceremony doesn't make us larger than we are," he said. "It makes the room big enough to hold the truth." The sentence landed without sound, the way a carrier lands at night, sure, practiced, miraculous every time. Laughter, the good kind, finally crept back, the relieved human kind that means we are safe to be decent now. The organist touched the keys with the softness of apology and found a modest, sunlit chord. Aunt Jo dabbed her eyes in a way that suggested she would be brave about it only for 2 more minutes tops. Then, the first fragile bridge extended. Richard stood. It wasn't a theatrical rise, no scrape of shoes, no deliberate throat clearing. He stood like a man whose body had decided to be honest before his pride issued the memo. His mouth opened, danger, always, but what came out was uncharacteristically small. "Claire," he said, and my name sounded like it had been run under cold water. "May I?" He gestured, not toward the ribbons, but toward the aisle. Every plan we made had left room for this possibility. A moment in which a man raised on control might try something adjacent to humility and not know how to land it. I gave him the smallest nod a daughter can give a father and still mean it. He stepped out, turned to the seals, and, here the floor of the world shifted a half-inch, brought his hand to his brow. It was not a crisp salute. It was crooked and late and wrong in 3 technical ways. It was also, unarguably, unsentimentally, an attempt. Chief Alvarez, who has corrected admirals with fewer syllables than it takes to order coffee, did not correct this. He returned the salute, perfect, minimal, and let the room translate. Richard lowered his hand and faced me. The man who speaks in statements fumbled for a noun. He found instead a verb. I was wrong, he said. No qualifiers, no footnotes, not even the corporate we. 2 words, more expensive than any he has ever spent. A murmur lifted and settled. Not applause, no one would cheapen the moment, but that soft rustle crowds make when they collectively let out a stitch. My mother's shoulders dropped a century. Ryan, who can read air pressure like a barometer reads seas, took my hand and placed it on his arm, a small repositioning that told the whole room, this is not a victory lap, this is a walkway. We stepped down one stair to meet Richard where he had, finally, chosen to stand. He did not reach for the ribbons. He looked at them. To look and not handle was itself a treaty. Your mother used to say I was afraid of church, he said quietly, a corner smile that had some earned rust in it now. She was right. I'm not afraid of God, you understand. I'm afraid of rules I don't write. Then today was useful, I said, and we both almost laughed, the kind that catches because it recognizes itself. Admiral Moore, never one to let a teachable moment squander itself, brought us back to the business at hand. Vows finished, rings warmed, the book received our names with its dry, ink-joy satisfaction. When he pronounced us, he did it with the gentle command of a man dismissing watch to sleep. You are released, he said. We were. The room was. On the way to the sacristy to sign the ledger, the corridor narrowed, a funnel of white plaster and old wood, where acoustics amplify whispers into confessions. There, beneath a brass sconce polished by a century of anxious hands, Richard touched the wall as if steadying himself against history. What do I do now? He asked. Not to me, not to Ryan, but to the part of himself arriving late to his own life. Begin small, I said. Say what you mean. Practice not touching what isn't yours. Stand when others stand. Advice fit for a child, a CEO, a country. He nodded, and the nod contained work. Back in the nave, the honor guard, mission complete, had dissolved into pews and hugs, the way good structure dissolves back into community. Civilians were suddenly bold enough to shake hands they'd been intimidated by 10 minutes earlier. 2 kids compared who could hold a salute longer. The organist found a hymn that sounded like sunlight landing on a kitchen table. Domestic, honest, unshowy. The photographer approached, tentative, and asked if we wanted the ribbon shot. I almost refused. Then I realized that photographs, like medals, are promises, kept only if handled with care. We took the picture, not as an emblem of triumph, but as a receipt, paid in full by many hands. Aunt Jo intercepted Richard with a paper cup of water and the authority of 5 older sisters. Here, she said, hydration is humble. He drank, which might be the first miracle the chapel has seen in decades. The payoff wasn't applause or vindication. It was a recalibration. The room had learned a new center. So had I. My life had not been a campaign to win an argument with my father. It had been the long, daily labor of becoming a person who could stand inside a vow without shaking when the wind changed. Today the wind had changed, and I had not. Before we stepped into the sacristy to sign, I turned once more to the congregation. The friends, the sailors, the donors who might finally donate to something more than their reflections, and offered the only benediction that felt honest. May your promises outlast your performances, I said. And may you stand for the truth even on days it isn't photogenic. Someone in the back, perhaps the child who had asked whether I was a general, whispered, "That's the good part." It was. Then the door closed softly behind us, and for a breath the world was only wood, ink, and the sound of our names learning to live beside each other on the same line. The reception became a gentler kind of weather. No thunderheads, just a sky that had decided to behave. People talked like doors opening. The band found a tempo that sounded like dishes being set on a table. I caught myself laughing, the unsure little laugh you use when your muscles are still translating shock into relief. Richard approached my mother the way a man approaches a grave he owes flowers. He bent, said something short, 3 words by the look of it, and she touched his cheek once, as if confirming that heat meant life. She did not perform forgiveness. She offered him the space where forgiveness might grow if he watered it. Later, in the sacristy, he waited by the ledger while we signed. The pen left our names with the calm authority of ink. Richard cleared his throat in the key of apology and said to Admiral Moore, "Thank you for the correction." The Admiral spared him the mercy of extra words. "It's what ceremony is for," he said, as if handing back a tool someone had misused and might yet learn to wield. Chief Alvarez shook Richard's hand in the doorway. No squeeze intended to dominate, no performative nod. Just 2 men agreeing in public on the cost of respect. We went home to a kitchen that had long been a courtroom. The lemon oil still held in the grain like memory. Someone, Aunt Jo again, a general disguised as an aunt, had left a casserole with instructions that felt like prayer. Heat at 180 degrees. Let rest. Serve with what you can manage. We ate standing, then sitting, then standing again when the conversation required the dignity of posture. Richard hovered near his chair, as if proximity might count for presence. At last he sat. He folded his hands, unfolded them, found no prop to hold. "I was wrong," he said again, not because he'd rehearsed it, but because the words fit. "I have treated your life like a stage I own. It isn't. I am learning the difference between an audience and a witness." My mother added hot water to a pot, the old ceremony of hospitality. "House rules," she said, setting mugs in a row. "We are kind. We are specific. We stand when standing is asked." She looked at Richard as she said the last part. He nodded. He asked about the ribbons, names, dates, what each color meant. I told him. Not as a lecture, as a roll call. Some names he wrote down in a small notebook he used to reserve for quarterly goals. This time, instead of targets, he wrote history he hadn't made but could honor. 2 days later, a thin envelope arrived at our apartment. Heavy paper, lighter man. Inside was a check, anonymous, to the fund that covers travel for sailors' families who can't afford to attend funerals. The memo line read, "For the names in the colors." He did not announce it. He mailed it and let the world be larger than his brand. He started small elsewhere, just as I'd asked. At dinner one week, he cleared his throat in that old way and said, "I'm proud of the work you do." It landed awkwardly, like a handshake in mittens, but it landed. Pride, unpracticed, still counts as practice. The next time he visited our place, he paused by the hook where my cover hung. He didn't touch it. He caught himself not touching it and smiled at his own restraint. "I'm learning," he said. "It's like switching hands to write." Then he surprised me. "Would you teach me to salute properly? I'd rather do one honest thing right than perform 10 empty ones." We stood in the hallway and worked through angles. Fingertips to brow, wrist straight, elbow neither flared nor collapsed. He laughed at himself once, then stopped, because laughing at work is a form of avoidance. By the third try, it wasn't perfect, but it was faithful. That's a better word anyway. Sundays changed. He still read the paper like a man interrogating a suspect, but he began to read the names below the fold aloud. On the mantel, a place once reserved for awards that measured profit, he placed a small framed card. House Rule Number 1. We stand. He didn't center it. He left it a little off to the side, as if humility should avoid the spotlight. At Thanksgiving, he set an extra plate. "For whoever needs a place," he said. It ended up belonging to Chief Alvarez, who told a story about a cook's birthday cake on a pitching deck and made everyone at the table vow silently to live long enough to be that kind of old. He asked about ships the way children ask about constellations, pointing, naming, misnaming, learning. He came to a commissioning ceremony with me and stood when asked, sat when told, and wiped his eye without needing a reason. When the national anthem played, he didn't sing. He held the silence like a chandelier holds light. Not the source of it, but responsible for keeping it from the floor. In time, the kitchen lost its courtroom tone. We still argued, humans do, but the verdicts got smaller and the breakfasts longer. He started making pancakes on Saturdays. The first batch were as rubbery as concession speeches. The 10th were edible. The 20th were good enough for seconds. He bought a cast iron skillet because some things are better when they hold heat for a long time. He went to therapy, not like a crusader, but like a man learning a craft. He came home with sentences that sounded like scaffolding. I confused control with care. I thought love was proof of competence. I'm trying to be curious where I used to be certain. He didn't demand applause for the work. He brought the work home and let it sit on the counter beside the lemons. At our anniversary, he toasted us with something that finally belonged to him. To the difference between performance and vow, he said. May I never again mistake the stage for the promise. He didn't look around to collect reactions. He looked at my mother, and then at me. That was enough. He still faltered. At a gala months later, someone asked about the chapel day with a smirk designed for gossip. I watched the old reflex gather in him, the need to turn truth into anecdote. Then he set his drink down like a man setting down a weapon. It was the day I stopped being the smartest man in the room, he said. It was a good day. The smirk ran out of steam. One evening, a storm rolled in off the harbor, the kind that makes window panes talk. Power blinked and stayed off. We lit candles, the kitchen built for arguments now performing as a sanctuary. Richard asked if he could see the ribbons again. I brought the case and placed it between us like a very old conversation finally allowed to be kind. He didn't touch. He read. Tell me about this one, he said. I did. We went ribbon by ribbon, name by name, ship by ship. Somewhere between them, the storm passed. The lights came back and we didn't notice for a while because the room was already lit. Years have a way of rounding off days until only a few retain their edges. Our wedding day kept its blade, but not as a threat, as a tool. It cuts through noise when we forget ourselves. It reminds us who we are when the old habits try to retake ground. A child, yes, that child from the chapel, sent a crayon drawing months later. 2 stick figures in white and black, a row of blue hat people behind them, and 4 silver stars drawn as big as moons. At the top, in careful letters, it said, "She is." We taped it to the fridge like scripture. Our family's liturgy is simple now. We stand. We apologize with verbs, not adjectives. We let people keep what they have earned. We practice salutes until they look honest. We eat pancakes that are good enough. We tell the truth, even when it isn't photogenic, especially then. My father still fumbles. He still reaches for control the way a hand reaches for a familiar rail in the dark. Some nights he catches himself, laughs, and lets go. Some nights he needs reminding. The difference is, he asks for it. The kitchen table lost its leash. The lemon oil is just lemon oil. The house has fewer mirrors and more windows. When sunlight falls across the wood, I see 4 small reflections move across it. Silver stars etched by memory. And I think of ships that keep going because someone promised they would. We don't rehearse that promise anymore. We keep it. That's the quiet ending people mistake for smallness. It is enormous. It is the kind that fits in a kitchen, at a table, on an ordinary morning when someone says, "Pass the syrup," and someone else stands because another person entered the room wearing a story that deserves it. That is our happiness. Not fireworks, not headlines. A family that finally learned a new language and chose to speak it at home. And when the wind changes, as it always does, we do what the sea taught us. Check the lines, steady the helm, stand our watch.